And to his enormous surprise, and no small amount of consternation, the sun replies to a shout, which was an invitation. The chief luminary, as he called the sun, agrees to come to tea with a proviso there be jam available on the table. Mayakovsky has literally invited the sun to come down and have tea with him, and to his enormous surprise and considerable pleasure, the sun has accepted his invitation. Well, but it's no small thing to see the sun coming towards you. He thought, my goodness, this is my last hour. But somehow he manages to overcome his initial fears, and it seems that when the sun sits down with him and has tea and shares the bread and jam, that as a matter of fact, they have many things in common. The sun says, look, do you think it's an easy thing to rise and set on schedule, to shine all the time while you're constantly on the move, giving light to the earth? The work is almost as draining as it is for the poet, who has to turn out his blasted propaganda posters. И скоро, дружбы не тая, бью по плечу его я, а солнце тоже, ты да я, нас, товарищ, двое. And soon, not shirking our friendship, I clapped him on the shoulder, and the sun replied, you and I, that makes two of us, comrade. It turns out that both of them share the same duty. Here is Mayakovsky actually chatting with the sun, that very sun that had caused him such anguish, that very sun of which people are afraid, that very sun to which people say prayers, beg the sun to help their life. That very sun is his guest and can actually be pushed to his purpose. And of course, what's the purpose of the sun? Well, the purpose of the sun is to shine always and everywhere. Nothing can interfere with this duty. And as a matter of fact, what's the purpose of the poet? Well, the purpose of the poet is the same. The poet should shine exactly like the sun everywhere, in every corner, in every crack in the system. Mayakovsky pictures himself as an equal with the center of the universe, sharing the cosmic duty of lighting up the world. The poem is a wonderfully cheeky proclamation of the poet's power, augmented by a socialist regime which will control nature and the sun itself. How short a distance it is from this confident, not to say arrogant stance, to the republic which has to be pulled out of the mud. Well, if the republic has to be pulled out of the mud, the poet who has the force of the sun can do this. And somehow that confidence, that cheekiness, that arrogance is a part of the poet which can be off-putting, but which can also be rather attractive when it's done in proper poetic form, when it's done with the kind of linguistic force that Mayakovsky is capable of. Well, of course, this went on for quite a few years, as you might imagine, since Mayakovsky called himself the tribune of the revolution, since Mayakovsky considered himself number one in poetry under the Soviet regime, a great deal of jealousy was aroused. Because after all, there were other people, there were other poets, there were other artists who also considered themselves the sun of the socialist culture, the sun of the socialist universe. They too wanted to have their place in the sun. And they were not too happy about Mayakovsky having this kind of arrogance, this kind of pride in what he was doing, and for that matter, this kind of power. So that he began to have a bunch of rivals. Furthermore, the socialist government itself was not entirely happy in having such an unpredictable and such an arrogant fellow as their ally. How could you rely on him? How could you tell that he wouldn't suddenly turn against you? How could you tell that he might go off in some direction that was totally crazy, that would commit the regime to doing all kinds of things they didn't want to do? This business of controlling the sun, this business of controlling nature, it's a very dangerous business, and they began to realize that. Mayakovsky began to understand that there were people within the regime itself who were very much against him, who would not be at all unhappy if some of his, so to speak, his wings were clipped, if some of his powers were taken away, if he wasn't considered the only number one man in the regime. And so things began to go in a rather more difficult way for Mayakovsky. So then he turned to another place to find a solution to some of his and the Socialist Republic's problems, in a place that you might not expect. That place was Brooklyn, New York. In 1925, he paid a visit to the United States of America. By the way, he came to Chicago, and he said, in Chicago, not an eyebrow is lifted without electrical power. And to Mayakovsky, that was a wonderful thing, that electricity would take over, that America was a country where the future seemed to be coming to pass, where all of life seemed to be submitted to technology. All of life was organized in a way that nature could not interfere, that nature could not do away with the things that they tried to do. And he fell into a position of adoration on a bridge built by the famous architect Brobling, the so-called Brooklyn Bridge. If you visited the Brooklyn Bridge, you know that it's a wonderful piece of architecture, that it's not only a great and powerful bridge, but also if you look at it as a work of art, it's really quite a remarkable thing with the steel cables coming up, with the curved cables coming down, the crisscross of the metal that you look at. It's really quite a remarkable thing to see, and it's possible to walk across the bridge and you get a wonderful feeling of what the futurists would have called true technology, true architecture. Now, to be sure, in Mayakovsky's case, one of its claims to fame turns out to be the glorious fact that the Russian poet stood there while composing his verses. Mayakovsky never lets go of the possibility of showing his power, his position. Nevertheless, the bridge itself stirs up strong feelings in the poet. Now, of course, he begins the poem with a kind of a paradox. Here is a red poet, that is a poet from the Soviet Union, coming to the United States at a time when, of all people, Calvin Coolidge is president, and here he is shouting the praises of what America has done in this Brooklyn Bridge. President Coolidge, he says, will shout and blush, red, he says, as the flag of the USSR, at the notion of a Soviet poet praising something in the USA. Как в церковь идет, помещавшийся верующий, как в скит удаляется строгий прост, так я в вечерний сереющий мерищий вхожу смиренный на Бруклинский мост. I hope you can get some of the feel of the sound of that poetry. As a believer who's gone out of his mind enters a church, you see, once again, he's going back to religious imagery. As a believer who's gone out of his mind enters a church and then goes into a monastery severe and simple, so I, in a graying evening fantasy, humbled, enter the Brooklyn Bridge. And he talks about that Brooklyn Bridge, which has set its steel foot on the shoulder of Manhattan and draws Brooklyn to it by the lip. He talks about the future professor of anthropology many, many centuries since who will come back to try to reconstruct the era through this bridge the way we now look at the bones of dinosaurs. We'll put the ribs of the bridge together the way that we put dinosaurs' ribs together, and somehow through the great technology of this bridge, through the wonderful metalwork, through the sense. It's built not, as he put it, not for a sense of style, but for a sense of construction. And through that sense of construction comes a magnificent new style, all of which very appropriate to the style of the future. This is what a futurist wants. It seems that all of New York has forgotten its troubles and its high buildings, and one hears only the soft drone of the elevated trains, those wonderful elevated trains that take people around so swiftly, none of this business of going around the streetcars pulled by horses, none of this slow movement that you find in the Russian city. The Russians, of course, love swift travel, and they thought the troika, that is the carriage drawn by 3 horses, was swift travel. But here you have electrical cabs which go along rails and which transport people swiftly from one place to another. How wonderful this is, and what a wonderful future this could be, not only for the USA, but also for Russia. There's a softness about the scene, which contrasts sharply with the harshness and determination of those who set a heavy steel foot in Manhattan and used cables to drag in Brooklyn by the lip. The reader understands that Mayakovsky sees in the impressive architecture and technology of the bridge a creation for the future, a creation which will define the shape of life for people all over the world, whether they're capitalists or socialists. This takes him out of his polemics with fellow artists and increasingly bureaucratic politicians at home. He's in a wonderful ecstasy of the creation of the future, the creation of this bridge, the creation of its steel, the creation of its cables, the cars which take people swiftly through the city, the increasingly active role of people within the city who are producing things that are necessary for the economy, this wonderful, wonderful future that he sees under socialism. Of course, socialism will do it even better than the United States. But then, suddenly he, in the midst of this ecstasy, he recalls something a little bit different. There's, after all, a contradiction here. How can he, a Soviet poet, after all, the Soviets, even at that time, showed the United States as the fortress of capitalism, the fortress of everything that they were trying to get away from, the fortress of what they were trying to fight. How could they create something that's so wonderful, that's so much a matter of the future? The future belongs to the Soviet Union, he thought, not to the U.S. He can't take it too far. The lyrical mood can't be allowed to take over. So he goes to another part of what he imagines to be the American reality. He thinks of unemployment. He thinks of the terrible repression of workers. He thinks of all the bad things that capitalism has done, that the socialist government presumably removed from what used to be Russia. He pictures desperate, unemployed workers on the bridge, not knowing what to do, where to turn, and the only thing they can do is to throw themselves in a suicide off the bridge into the river. And what river do they fall into? He says they fall into the Hudson River. Now, of course, there's only one problem. The Brooklyn Bridge is not over the Hudson River. It's over the East River, which is on the other side of Manhattan. So this poor unemployed fellow not only had to jump off the bridge to commit suicide, but he had to do a broad jump all the way across Manhattan in order to fall into the Hudson River. As some people say, it's the longest broad jump ever recorded in poetry. Such plain facts don't seem to bother the Soviet poet, but, as a matter of fact, maybe he was well aware that it was over the East River, that it was necessary for him to do it this way, and so he did it this way. The poem ends on a triumphant note in the praise of the bridge and the spirit it represents. The USA and the future of technology are ideas that obviously deeply appeal to Mayakovsky. He says, as an Eskimo gapes at a train, as he looks at everything around, da Brooklynski most, da это вещь. Yes, the Brooklyn Bridge, that is a wondrous creation. A wondrous creation, of course, that Mayakovsky would very much like to bring back to the Soviet Union, a wondrous creation that he would like to make the basis of future life. Mayakovsky dreams of the time when this technology will take over, when Soviet power and socialist power will extend itself throughout the entire world, and it will create a world that does away with tuberculosis, that does away with prostitution, that does away with all the terrible problems of exploitation that a capitalist, a pre-revolutionary regime experienced, and instead it will be bound up in this marvelous architecture of the future, in cables of steel, in girders of steel, in walls of glass, in cities that will spring from the plains like magnificent creatures. All of these things are wonderful in his view of the future. But, of course, he's not talking now about the Soviet Union. He's talking about the United States of America. He's seen all of these things in the United States of America. What happens when he goes back to the Soviet Union? Well, of course, naturally, when he goes back, people are not too happy about what he's had to say about the United States of America. Furthermore, he has also spent some time in Paris, where, of all things, he's met a beautiful emigre Russian woman by the name of Tatyana Yakovleva. He claims she had a perfect ear for poetry, but she was also obviously, at least according to the description of Mayakovsky, a very, very beautiful woman. And he fell deeply in love with her. Well, when Mayakovsky said he fell deeply in love with someone, that meant maybe for a certain amount of time. He had already been through perhaps 4 or 5 so-called deep loves, which ended up by his throwing the woman over. Here he had found at last the woman of his dreams, the woman with a perfect ear for poetry, the woman with a beautiful figure, the woman with a beautiful face. And he said to her, look, come back with me to the Soviet Union. Well, she may have had a marvelous ear for poetry, and she may well have been a very beautiful woman, but she also had a certain amount of common sense, and she realized that going back to the Soviet Union was not for a woman like her, so she refused, and Mayakovsky had to go back without her. Well, of course, this set up in him a very difficult kind of feeling. He dreamed of somehow rejoining his Tatyana in Paris and getting her to come to the Soviet Union, but by this time the regime was not too happy about his leaving, and they wouldn't let him get to Paris. So here he was caught in this tremendous desire to get back to Tatyana, being forced to live in Russia with the memory of that futurist dream that he thought he saw on the Brooklyn Bridge of America, all whirling in his mind and his imagination. Mayakovsky was in a very, very difficult spot. And of course, in the next lecture, we'll turn to a play that he wrote that dealt not only with the difficulties that he found himself, but with the whole difficulties of this great dream of the socialist future, which would be just like the Brooklyn Bridge.